Welcome to this week's episode of The Read Out Loud, a weekly biotech podcast from Stat. I'm Meg Terrell.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, May 25th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
Hospitals and healthcare companies are racing to implement large language models like ChatGPT into their businesses. Stat reporter Casey Ross joins us to explain what the technology can and can't do, and what experts want the world to know before embracing generative AI.
There was also major news this week on Sarepta Therapeutics gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, as well as updates on new medicines in development for weight loss.
We'll also discuss the rest of the week's biggest biopharma news.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hey there, my name is Nicholas St. Fleur. I'm a science reporter here at Stat, and I'm thrilled to announce the second season of Color Code, Stat's podcast on racial health inequities. In our second season, we're taking things local to my hometown of Long Island.
Long Island's history is one of segregation. Long Island continues to be one of the most segregated parts of our country.
Where you live has a huge impact on your health. Long Island is a microcosm of racial health inequities that exist in suburbs across the country.
The racial residential segregation in a place like Nassau County, starting from infant mortality to premature death and everything in between. We see that many of these causes of death are consistently higher in communities of color.
We'll hear from researchers, patients, clinicians, and advocates on the health inequities Long Islanders face and how communities here are trying to close these gaps. From the front lines of a battle over a landfill to the efforts to address food insecurity and disparities in maternal mortality across the island. Racism in medicine is a national emergency. Together, let's raise the alarm.
So as the cultural conversation continues to maybe focus on is too strong a term, but include weight loss medicines like Wegovy, which seem to make a new type of headline each week. This week, the headline was not necessarily about that injectable medicine itself, but rather about the apparently multitude of oral alternatives to it that are in development. We heard about the oral version of Wegovy itself from its manufacturer, Novo Nordisk, having positive data in phase 3, but also some oral medications that seek to do similar things, if not the same thing, conceivably better or more tolerably, that are in development at other companies. Meg, what did we learn this week?
So the news that probably kicked all of this off, maybe in a sort of misplaced way, at least to analysts who are following this industry, was some news out of Pfizer, data published in the journal JAMA Network Open on a phase 2 product it has called danuglipron, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is an oral version, a small molecule version of a GLP-1 analog that it has where you can take it by pill twice a day. And, you know, these data suggested that the efficacy that you see here, this was tested in type 2 diabetes, was similar to what you get with the injectable medicines. And that sparked a huge move in Pfizer's stock. I think I saw Umar Rafat's note suggesting it added like $10 billion in market value on this update. And what's really funny about it is the data had already been presented, I think, last year. And this was just sort of, you know, publishing the data. The efficacy numbers were the same. But what it suggests is that, you know, these pills are coming to potentially replace or at least, you know, provide another option to these once weekly, you know, injectable versions of these drugs. What's also funny, though, is Pfizer has another drug in development, and it's going to choose one or the other to take forward into phase 3. The other one's just once a day that you take orally. You know, just everybody's kind of just like chuckling a little bit about the fact that there was such a reaction. And I think it just shows there's so much interest in these drugs right now.
Yeah, you know, with Pfizer stock significantly underperforming these days, I'm sure that the company appreciated the bump, even if it wasn't maybe justified. But Meg, looking even further ahead, and you did a story this week about kind of, I don't know if you call it next generation or sort of what's next in the kind of weight loss pipeline. What is exciting out there?
According to a note from TD Cowen, which came out several months ago, there were at least almost 24 drugs in development just trying to go the oral route for these GLP-1s or similar medicines. But in addition to, trying to provide different administration options, companies are working on trying to improve the efficacy. And that's really sort of remarkable when you consider just how much weight loss these drugs already produce. You get up to about 15% with Wegovy, according to its phase 3 clinical trial. And then with Lilly's tirzepatide, which is sort of has this like dual effect where you're not just targeting GLP-1, but also GIP, you get up to 22% weight loss. And then I was talking with Louis Aroney at Weill Cornell, who has led a lot of these studies and consults for a lot of these companies. And he said with this sort of next generation version, which is these triple effect drugs. He called one of them triple G because it adds glucagon to GIP and GLP-1. You could imagine 25 to 30% weight loss. And there is a drug that Lilly plans to take into phase 3 this year that is that sort of triple G compound. And so we'll have to see how well they work and then what the side effects look like. But on top of even that, some of these, next generation or things that are in the pipeline, try to have more health benefits too, like focusing on fat in the liver and targeting things like NASH. There's also a compound that Dr. Aroney told me about that's pretty early, but it's designed to sort of stimulate muscles so that you don't have as much lean body mass loss as you're losing weight. So that could be really helpful for these drugs as well.
Yeah, isn't that one of the issues with these drugs, Meg, that you lose? Not only are you losing fat, but you're also losing lean muscle mass, right? I mean, that's one of the things that people talk about as a potential issue, right?
You guys had a really interesting conversation about that, I think, at one of your summits. And it was sort of jarring to see how much lean body mass is also lost with these medicines. But people point out when you lose weight, that does happen. And Dr. Aroney told me, the makeup of the body improves as you lose weight. Even if you're losing lean muscle mass as well, the sort of overall ratio does get better. But if you could prevent a lot of that, it would be particularly helpful in older patients where you really don't want to, make frailty even worse by losing lean muscle mass.
The whole thing kind of calls to mind the early days, or even I guess the present, of immunotherapies for cancer, where, there was an initial hit on one scientific target that seemed to work, and then slowly but surely did researchers figure out, with trial and error and a lot of error, which other targets might be coupled with that to make those initial medicines more powerful, which is kind of what the whole like triple G phenomenon sounds like. And then likewise, and as you point out in your story, just as in immuno-oncology, surely some of these drugs will not succeed in clinical trials. But it also occurred to me in a business sense, what we saw in oncology is that after the first PD-1 treatment was approved, most companies in the cancer space decided they needed a PD-1 of their own, to where I believe there are 8 FDA-approved PD-1s or PDL-1s now. It could be 7. The point is, I wonder if we will see a similar kind of land grab with GLP-1, where some of the companies that have traditionally played in diabetes or in metabolic health or cardiovascular health, who missed out on that first wave that Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly capitalized on, will maybe acquire some of these smaller firms with GLP-1 treatments in development, because that will be the baseline upon which they will seek to build combination therapies for this imagined future where this is like a tent pole of modern medicine. But then, and we said this so many times in this podcast that I will do it as briefly as possible, you cannot overstate the importance of the data that we're looking forward to from Novo Nordisk this summer on whether treating people diagnosed as overweight or with obesity with these medicines actually does lead to long-term health benefits, because that is the key to the kind of elephant in the room with all of the investment in these medicines, which is getting them consistently reimbursed such that they become as lucrative as people think they will, which wasn't as much of an issue, obviously, in immuno-oncology, because cancer drugs just have a cleaner path toward reimbursement by virtue of being literally life-saving. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, no, I think those are incredibly important points, Damien. And, on the small company, part of this, whether they're acquisition targets for the big companies, I spoke with Ray Stevens, the CEO of Sarepta Therapeutics, for this story. They have an oral GLP-1 in development, or they're focused on this area. And also have to give him a shout out because he said he listens to us every week when he's on his run. And so Hi, Ray. Hope you're having a safe run. Watch out for cars. It's really interesting to think about the small companies that have developed drugs in this space. How do you go up against a Pfizer, an Eli Lilly, a Novo Nordisk, who already have these huge sales forces, et cetera? And he was saying, they're trying to do it through really smart design of their drugs to try to improve, perhaps things, not just efficacy, but also the safety profile of these things. There are on-target safety concerns, tolerability concerns, the nausea, the vomiting that you hear about with these things, which he said oral drugs could potentially improve because you could, modulate the titration a little bit better for patients as you're starting therapy. But also any potential off-target safety risks, he said they can try to mitigate with, really smart, precise design of their drugs. So I think it'll be really interesting to see the small companies working in this space. And then, of course, the sort of land grab that will almost inevitably happen if these are successful.
So moving on, it seems not a week goes by these recent months without there being some massively pivotal news involving Sarepta Therapeutics and its quest to win FDA approval for a gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And Adam, this week was no different. What happened?
I feel like Sarepta is becoming the new Biogen of this podcast, so we talk about it all the time. But you're right, Damien. There is always news. This week, what we learned was that the expected FDA approval decision for Sarepta's gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy has been delayed by just about a month. We were expecting that decision on May 29th, which is Memorial Day, obviously. That decision is now expected to come on June 22nd. And it does sound like, at least from the perspective of Sarepta, what we've learned, obviously this is Sarepta telling us all of this. This is not the FDA. But it does sound like that the FDA is willing to grant accelerated approval to the gene therapy, but there are some conditions.
Well, Adam, this is something that you actually sort of foretold was coming. Last week, you had suggested that there might be a 3-month delay as they looked at some of the manufacturing, and it looks like maybe less of a delay than that. So that in some ways is positive news. But what are some of the conditions that it looks like the FDA is looking at?
Yeah, it sounds like the FDA is amenable to approving this with a restricted label by age. And it looks like where they're going with this, at least initially, will be an approval for boys with Duchenne age 4 to 5. Now, this is the data, that's the strongest, most persuasive data that Sarepta has. They ran into trouble with their previous clinical trials when they looked at the gene therapy in older boys. So at least initially, it looks like they'll get accelerated approval on 4 to 5-year-olds. And then when they complete the phase 3 confirmatory study that they are running, and those data are expected towards the end of the year. Now that study is being run in boys ages, I think, 4 to 7. So it's a broader patient population. And depending on what those data look like, the FDA will grant full approval and also potentially expand the label to, encompass this broader group of patients.
So zooming out to Sarepta's business, what does that mean for the future of this medicine in terms of its availability in the long term, and also, kind of all the hemming and hawing that has gone on, not so much by the company, but in terms of people watching from the outside of this process? Could this be perceived as kind of a compromise that will satisfy a multitude of parties, or is this the kind of thing that everybody will be upset about?
Yeah, I think compromise is a really good way of thinking about this, Damien. First, from the perspective of the FDA and whether or not this gene therapy should be granted accelerated approval, as we've talked about, there was a lot of controversy about that, and obviously this is being pushed very heavily by the company and by patients with Duchenne and their families and advocates. So I think what the FDA is doing here is kind of threading the needle a little bit. They're saying, yes, we'll put this on the market. We will limit the scope of, who can use this gene therapy based on kind of the most persuasive data we have today, waiting for stronger, more confirmatory data to expand the use of this gene therapy. So again, I think that it kind of gives the FDA a little bit of out. Everyone gets a little bit of something what they want. Obviously the Duchenne community gets a gene therapy on the market. Maybe critics who think that the data aren't strong enough yet, the restrictions sort of maybe appease them a little bit. So I kind of sort of see that like very much like a middle ground. From a commercial perspective, obviously a label restricted by age means that that at least initially Sarepta will have a much more limited patient population to which they can market this. I've seen some estimates of like between 800 and maybe 1,000 boys initially would be amenable or re-eligible for this gene therapy. Obviously, that could grow over time. The other thing but I guess on the other hand, I think that this rollout was always expected to be probably a little bit slow or metered, just because there's a lot of complexity and logistics that go into getting the gene therapy. This is not a pill that you just take. No one writes a prescription. You go to the pharmacy and you get a pill for gene therapy. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into diagnosing these patients, screening these patients, and then going through the logistics that are involved with having to get this infused. So I think that was always anticipated that this was going to be a slower rollout as doctors, as the centers that sort of treat patients with Duchenne sort of figure out how to handle, administering a gene therapy that they've never used before. So in that ways, maybe the skinnier label, so to speak, doesn't matter as much.
And then, guys, there were also some headlines this week about a potential COVID surge in China. Damien, of course, this affected the stocks of Moderna and BioNTech and similar companies. What was your reaction to that?
Well, confusion, I guess. Number one, I believe it was on Tuesday, that Moderna, which of course markets a vaccine for COVID-19, BioNTech, which co-markets one with Pfizer, and then CureVac, which markets nothing, all rose by about 10%, which, considering the size, especially of Moderna and BioNTech, is a huge swing in valuation. And so I kind of went on the internet to try to figure out what was going on. And I couldn't find anything other than, as you mentioned, reporting out of China that the nation is preparing for a potential surge in cases due to an alarming new subvariant of the virus. But I assume that is the only, or that is what drove the weird stock movements for those three companies, which kind of normalized the next day. But even that is confusing to me because, of course, China famously, Moderna and BioNTech do not sell their vaccines in China. It's a little bit complicated. I think one is available for expats, et cetera, but they never managed to crack the Chinese market, I think in large part because Beijing doesn't want them to. China has focused on homegrown vaccines, and the reporting I saw about this predicted surge in Bloomberg specifically cited that the nation is accelerating the development of bespoke, variant-specific vaccines from domestic manufacturers. So if you were bidding up the share prices of Moderna, BioNTech, and CureVac, most confusingly, based on what's happening in China, I'm not really sure what you're seeing in terms of how that might affect their businesses, and their businesses, which, at least for the first two companies, are in a dramatic and predicted decline in 2023 because the demand for their products is not nearly what it was in 2021 and 2022. So I don't really know how to button that up other than weird things happen on Wall Street day to day.
Hello, and welcome to the Read Out Loud, the podcast that brings you the latest in healthcare and biotech news. I'm your host, Meg Terrell, and joining me today is a very special guest, Casey Ross, a brilliant reporter from Stat News.
That's right, Meg. Casey is an absolute powerhouse in the world of healthcare journalism. His insightful reporting and in-depth analysis have made him a trusted voice in the industry.
Absolutely, Damien. Casey's coverage spans a wide range of topics, from groundbreaking medical advancements to the intricate workings of the pharmaceutical world. He's been at the forefront of the most critical healthcare stories, consistently delivering top-notch reporting.
And what sets Casey apart is his ability to humanize the complexities of healthcare. He dives deep into the lives of patients, providers, and innovators, giving us a window into their experiences and challenges.
That's precisely why we are so excited to have him here today. Casey's unique perspective and wealth of knowledge will undoubtedly enrich our discussion and provide our listeners with a deeper understanding of the healthcare landscape.
So without further ado, let's welcome Casey Ross, the remarkable Stat News reporter who continues to shape the conversation around healthcare and biotech.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here and thrilled to engage in a meaningful conversation about the topics that truly matter in healthcare.
Well, we're delighted to have you, Casey. Your work inspires us and countless others. Together, let's explore the stories behind the headlines and uncover the transformative potential of healthcare innovation.
So listeners, get ready for an episode filled with captivating insights, thought-provoking discussions, and, of course, some surprises along the way.
Stay tuned as we dive into the fascinating world of healthcare with the incredible Casey Ross from Stat News.
Okay, that is enough of that. That strained dialogue about incredible journeys is what I got when I asked ChatGPT, the oft-discussed generative AI tool, to help me introduce stat reporter Casey Ross on a podcast. It was, like many products of generative AI, kind of impressive, but subtly inaccurate, and in the end, questionably useful.
And if I may make a suggestion for the next time you do this, ask it for a short intro, because that was ridiculous. Anyway, so this experience somewhat mirrors the early results of so-called large language models when put to use in healthcare. And this week, Casey was part of a team of stat reporters who published a series of stories looking at how generative AI is already changing the practice of medicine and the debate around whether it's being used safely.
So Casey, earnestly and non-robotically this time, thanks for coming back to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It's nice to be here as a real human.
Well, before we get to all the inspiring and thought-provoking things that we've promised, maybe let's start with like the absolute basics. When you type a question, whether about healthcare or podcasts for that matter, into a tool like ChatGPT, what is it doing to come up with the answer?
It's doing math is the sort of shortest answer. It's much like the autocomplete that you have in your email or on your phone. It's next word prediction. So it's predicting based on all the patterns of text that it's learned over time, what is the most likely next word. And it's using probability as kind of a proxy for reason. So if you like picture a crossword puzzle with certain letters filled in, what you see when you ask ChatGPT a question is sort of that matrix getting filled in.
Generative AI tools aren't new, but they seem to be newly ubiquitous. What happened that led to the recent explosion in popularity?
The release of ChatGPT came after one of these models was trained on impossible amounts of data. So what nobody had sort of realized was that when you put basically a autocomplete architecture with internet scale, web scale data, then you get this model that is able to sort of retain knowledge or information in a way and then pattern match and respond in these very open-ended ways that we haven't seen generative AI or any kind of AI tool like that do before. So it's really captured the popular imagination.
So Casey, how are these tools getting put to use in health and medicine? Maybe give us an example, a use case.
Yeah, a simple use case that is being tested right now at three health systems, University of Wisconsin, UC San Diego, and Stanford, is to use GPT to respond to questions that are posed within patient portals. These are the portals that everybody now has that list all your health records, and you can go in and you can make appointments and do other things. And sometimes you might ask a question in the portal of your clinician, and there are sort of an exponential increase in these questions, and health systems can't answer them fast enough. So why not use a tool like ChatGPT if it can answer them accurately? And so that's being tested right now. And those are the kinds of use cases I think we're going to see in the early run before we get to more complicated and risky things like using it for diagnosis.
Well, yeah, I wanted to get to the risk because I think that distinction you made is important, that it is doing mathematics. It's using a data set to predict what the next word would be in a string of words. It is not thinking or reasoning. As you said, it is kind of like a proxy for reason, but like behind all of the marketing, it really is just like a big math tool. So then when you apply it to something like medicine, where reason and actual thought are very important, what are the risks that experts foresee as this technology kind of continues to pervade health and medicine?
It doesn't know the difference between what's false and what's true, and it doesn't care. So when you ask it a question, it's going to produce an answer. And if it happens to be accurate and factual, well, then that's just a really happy coincidence. But we need those happy coincidences to happen in healthcare. You can't give people inaccurate information because decisions are going to be made off of that information, that are going to hurt people. And the other thing I think we have to worry about is as we rely on these tools, you have to really think about how it's going to affect human beings and their ability to do the tasks that ChatGPT is suddenly doing for them. I don't know about you, but when I drive around now and my phone dies out and my GPS is no longer working, it's not a good situation. I think my native sense of direction has gotten worse. What is going to happen when we lean on these tools to do things that until now we've been having to think through on our own?
I am definitely in the same boat as you. I actually found some directions that I had printed out from multiple decades ago before we had these phones and like GPS in our cars and stuff like that. And I was like, holy crap, I can't believe we used to do this. Anyway, so what kinds of rules and regulations are healthcare institutions putting in place around the use of these kinds of tools, especially when you think about things like using patient data to train these models?
Yeah, we don't know much about that. I think they are kind of building that plane while it's in the air. So they're going about testing these, and I think they're using their usual sort of internal processes like IRB to sort of vet these projects and sort of come up with the parameters. But right now, each system, as they build their own tools, they're doing that on their own. I'm sure there's some comparing of notes going on, but this is, it's a frontier, and, frontiers are lawless.
So, Casey, with this technology, there's an issue called the hallucination problem. Can you explain what that is and how researchers are dealing with it?
Yeah, these tools will just make things up. I mean, when you talk about generative AI, you can probably just cross out the word generative and replace it with make things up, because that's what they do. They're supposed to make things up based on everything, all of the data that they have within them. But there are ways to deal with that. You can train your model on a technique known as reinforcement learning, where you give the model human feedback so that it learns which response is preferential based on the human's review of the output to figure out which one is the best one to use. So when you do that, you can help sort of counteract the problem of hallucination, but it requires sort of a very focused training approach to make sure that you can get rid of the factual inaccuracies. And there's no way you're going to be able to stamp them all out, because it's just a tremendous amount of data and you never know what someone's going to ask.
So zooming out even beyond healthcare, there was a Senate committee hearing last week, I think it was last week, Casey, that I know you tuned into, in which the legislators of this nation looked at this issue, AI more generally, and the frontier that it presents, as you described, and kind of thought hard out loud about how it ought to be regulated, while joined by some of the leaders of the industry. How did that hearing play out, and what do people think might come of the renewed or new legislative attention toward this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very unusual hearing in the sense that you had the technology leaders for very big companies coming to Congress and saying, you really should regulate what we're doing here. And there was a willingness by the members of Congress, it seemed, to ask some questions about how the technology works in a more humble way, so that you didn't have people making these huge mistakes in asking the questions that sort of betrayed their knowledge of the subject. But it did feel a little bit kind of like puppeteering in a way. It was clear that they had rehearsed the testimony a little bit in advance, if not formally, then at least informally, because Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, had met with all the senators and many of the House members in meetings beforehand. So there was a kind of a familiarity and a collegiality there, where it seemed as though they'd sort of had decided there was going to be a very friendly conversation that went on. What's going to come out of it, not quite sure. I think they're talking about creating a new federal agency, and I think you will see some legislation that would create an agency focused specifically on regulating AI in this new and more powerful form.
So, Casey, for the Luddites out there, is there any way to avoid generative AI? Or are we just inevitably all going to be using it?
I think it's inevitable. I just don't see any way. I mean, yes, you can just go out into the woods and have a cabin and it's walled in and thorough and all that, and you can kind of, completely distance yourself from society. But if you're going to be around in the world that we all live in and be a part of society, then these tools are going to find their way into your lives, and other people around you are going to be using them as well. So I think that it's going to scale up and be embedded, I would say, fairly quickly.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. But before we go, we want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our special guest, Casey Ross from Stat News.
Absolutely, Meg. Casey, your insights and expertise have truly elevated our conversation today. Your dedication to uncovering the stories that shape healthcare is commendable.
Okay, ChatGPT wrote a whole outro that is considerably longer than what you just heard, albeit equally ridiculous, but we will spare you having to hear that. Casey, in real life, non-robotically, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun to be here.
That does it for another episode of the Read Out Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and whether you think your host should be replaced by generative AI robots. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.